They walked with heads bowed and eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if looking up might expose them to something worse than capture. Their boots were caked in the mud of collapsing roads, their uniforms stiff with dust and fear. These were not soldiers in retreat. They were remnants, auxiliaries, telephone operators who had once sat behind desks patching calls and now trudged forward in a silence louder than artillery. Each step was a step into the unknown, a place their commanders had promised would be hell. For months, they had been fed one consistent message. If the Allies caught you, you'd be stripped, starved, shamed, or worse. Some had heard tales of women executed on sight. Others whispered stories of mass humiliation, of captors parading German women through villages, letting civilians spit and jeer. The fear wasn't just a product of propaganda. It was cultivated, watered daily by officers who knew their own retreat was inevitable and needed someone else to bear the brunt of the loss. So when the moment finally came, when a group of American soldiers appeared on the road ahead, weapons slung but not raised, the silence among the women was absolute. No screams, no pleas, only raised hands and braced hearts. They expected yelling, rifles pressed to backs, or at least the cold contempt of victors. But the Americans didn't even seem angry. They gave a single order: walk. And so they did. The women were herded like cattle down a gravel path that wound through a pine forest, the trees indifferent to the history unraveling beneath them. There was no brutality, but no comfort either. The Americans weren't smiling, but they weren't leering. They were efficient, businesslike, moving with the weariness of men who had done this too many times before. That in itself was unsettling. This wasn't a special event, it was a routine. When the gate of the enclosure finally swung open, it made a sound like the closing of a tomb. They were no longer moving toward an uncertain future. They had arrived inside it. The camp, ringed in barbed wire, held tents in rows, soldiers with clipboards, and silence broken only by boots on gravel. It didn't look like a punishment ground. It looked organized. That, somehow, made it worse. As they were lined up, names taken, personal items confiscated, a kind of numbness began to settle in. One woman gave up a photograph of her brother. Another surrendered a locket that had belonged to her mother. Nothing violent was said or done, but the quiet, meticulous way in which their identities were stripped from them made the process feel even more invasive. Some of the women tried to remain stoic, drawing strength from one another. Others couldn't stop trembling, not from cold, but from the cognitive dissonance. This was not what they had been told to expect. There was no mockery, no beatings, just forms, orders, translation through interpreters, and that unnerving sense that they were now part of a process they didn't understand. That night, huddled in straw-lined tents, they whispered to one another in disbelief. Were the Americans waiting to lower the mask? Was this silence the calm before some horror? Or had everything they'd been told, everything they believed about their enemy, been a lie? The questions were as heavy as their exhaustion. And none of them knew that this was only the first crack in the wall that was about to collapse. The first night passed slowly, with every creak of boots and distant clang of metal sounding like a prelude to violence. The women didn't sleep so much as collapse into short spells of exhaustion, waking often to check if the guards were moving toward them. They kept their boots on and clutched their coats tightly, as if ready to run, though there was nowhere left to go. Outside the tents, soldiers murmured in English, their voices low and unreadable. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't comfort either. It was something colder: indifference. Morning came with a whistle, sharp and final, cutting through the fog of fatigue like a blade. They were ordered to line up. The announcement was simple, translated roughly into German: medical inspection. The words alone sent a shiver down their spines. Inspections were not neutral events in their minds. For women who had spent the last weeks hearing about atrocities committed in the East, the word inspection felt like a coded threat. A row of tables had been arranged in the open field. Soldiers brought out metal canisters, paper forms, and crates of supplies. Nurses in white armbands moved with mechanical precision, setting up thermometers, flashlights, and rubber gloves. The scene looked like something out of a field hospital, but to the prisoners, every object looked like a tool for punishment. Their fear had become instinctual, not reasoned. Each gesture by the Americans was filtered through layers of rumor and dread. One woman near the front saw a canister hiss slightly as it was opened and began to tremble violently. Others turned their heads away from the sight, unwilling to look. The memory of whispered stories about poisoned showers, gas, and sterilization had taken root deep inside them. They didn't scream, but the panic was palpable. Arms crossed over chests, eyes flickered, knees locked. Their bodies stood still, but their thoughts ran wild. When the inspection began, the process was efficient and impersonal. Eyes were checked, skin examined, arms inspected for bites or rashes. The women flinched at every touch, even when it was clinical. One by one, they were dusted with white powder shaken from the metal cans. It stuck to their hair, coats, and skin like flour. Some coughed. Others stared at the ground, trying not to cry. No explanation was given at first. Only when one woman began to cry out in confusion did a nurse mutter in broken German, "For lice." That explanation, though logical, did little to calm the storm inside them. It wasn't the powder that hurt, it was what it represented. To be dusted like livestock, without warning, by strangers in uniform, chipped away at what little dignity they still carried. Some tried to wipe it off frantically. Others didn't move at all, as if the powder confirmed everything they had feared, that they were no longer people, only things to be processed. At the far end of the line, the women were handed a bar of soap, rough, olive-colored, stamped with block letters, U.S. Army. Most held it in their palms like it was foreign currency, unsure whether to be thankful or terrified. It felt strange to receive something practical, even helpful, from the very people they expected to harm them. The soap was real. That alone made it suspicious. Then came the order that shattered the fragile calm. Showers. The word swept through the line like a gust of wind, carrying with it a second wave of fear. Some women froze. Others whispered to each other, "Is it real? Is it safe?" No one knew. And as steam curled in the distance from makeshift pipes, the air thickened not just with moisture, but with the weight of everything they had been taught to believe. The queue inched forward, but each step toward the showers felt like a step toward execution. Steam rose in slow, ghostly tendrils from the pipes, wrapping the area in an eerie mist. The women clutched their soap bars like talismans, unsure whether they were meant for cleansing or ritual. Some couldn't stop trembling. Others bit their lips until they bled, refusing to let fear show. The word showers echoed in their minds, distorted by years of war stories. It wasn't hygiene they associated with that word. It was gas, disappearance, erasure. They reached the threshold of the stalls and paused. No guards barked orders. No rifles were raised. Just a motion of the hand, a gesture toward the steam and running water. The absence of aggression was confusing. If this was punishment, it was strangely quiet. If it was mercy, it came too unexpectedly to feel real. Inside the stalls, the metal pipes hissed as water sprayed down in a constant, heavy rhythm. The sound was ordinary, water hitting concrete, but to them, it was disorienting. Marta stepped in first, flinching as the droplets struck her skin. She expected pain. She expected to fall. But all that came was heat. Hot water rolled down her back, soaking her tangled hair and leaving muddy streaks along her legs. Around her, other women began to wash.
Slowly at first, hesitant hands moving across filthy skin, unsure whether they were allowed to feel relief. Then more urgently, as the water loosened weeks of grime and sweat, as if it could scrub away everything they'd endured. Soap foamed between fingers. The scent was sharp and unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. It was the smell of something they thought they had lost: normalcy. Some began to cry, silently, tears indistinguishable from the water cascading down their cheeks. There was no speaking, just breathing, scrubbing, and the sound of water. The emotional release was not loud, but it was profound. One girl leaned her head against the wall, eyes closed, mouthing a prayer she hadn't said in years, not for survival, but for understanding. What shocked them the most wasn't that they were spared. It was that they were given time. Time to bathe. Time to clean their bodies as if they were still people. No one rushed them. No one watched them closely. The guards remained outside. Their presence felt more than seen. And that absence of pressure created space for the impossible: reflection. When the showers ended, the women dried themselves with scratchy towels that felt luxurious simply for existing. Their skin was raw, pink from scrubbing, their hair dripping onto the cold floor. But they were cleaner than they had been in months. As they stepped out, one by one, something hung in the air that none of them could name. It wasn't peace. It wasn't safety. It was something more fragile: uncertain dignity. Returning to the enclosure, wrapped in towels and silence, they looked at one another with new eyes. Not as comrades or prisoners, but as women who had just experienced something utterly disarming. The fear hadn't vanished. It still hovered at the edges of their thoughts. But it was joined now by something else: a flicker of doubt. A question they had never dared to ask. If the enemy gave them soap and showers, what else might be a lie? In the days following the showers, the camp settled into an eerie rhythm. Every morning began with a whistle, a roll call, and the same cautious glances exchanged among the prisoners. The fear hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted shape. Now it lived in the silence, in the waiting, in the uncertainty of what each new routine might reveal. The women were still captives, surrounded by wire and watched by men with rifles, but the expected cruelty never arrived. Meals came at regular intervals, served in dented metal tins. The food was simple: porridge, beans, a slice of bread, but it was consistent, almost reliable. That reliability was confusing. It dulled the panic, but replaced it with something just as unsettling: the slow realization that the enemy was not behaving like an enemy at all. They were being fed, counted, washed, and kept alive with the efficiency of a well-managed system. Some of the guards began to feel familiar, though no names were exchanged. One of them, tall and freckled, tried to greet the women in broken German, fumbling over words like blanket and bread. His effort was clumsy, but it cracked something in the silence. One day, a girl named Erica corrected his pronunciation, and he laughed, a short, surprised sound. No one joined him, but no one reported him either. It was the first shared moment not dictated by orders. The nurses returned regularly, checking for fever, passing out ointment, and inspecting for lice. Their faces remained neutral, but their hands were steady, gentle. One prisoner, weakened from the march, was given aspirin and left to rest. She wasn't punished for her frailty. She was treated. That act, small and procedural, had the weight of a confession. The enemy saw them not just as prisoners, but as human bodies in need of care. Around the campfires at night, voices grew a little louder. The women no longer whispered out of terror, but out of habit. They talked about home, about the last letters they'd received, about food they missed, or the sound of music before the air raid sirens. Memory became their escape. In these shared stories, they reclaimed pieces of themselves that war had scattered. They weren't just prisoners anymore.
They were individuals remembering who they had been. But not everyone accepted the shift. Katerina, always the skeptic, warned against softening. "Don't be fooled," she muttered one night. "Order is not kindness." Others nodded, but the words felt thinner than before. It was getting harder to hold on to the image of the Americans as monsters when they handed out blankets on cold nights and kept the latrines clean. The contradiction pressed on them from every direction. How could this structured, indifferent care exist alongside the hatred they had been taught? It didn't make sense, and yet it was happening. The rules in this camp were followed with quiet discipline. They weren't caged like animals, and they weren't treated like friends. They existed in a limbo between enemy and subject, acknowledged, managed, but not dehumanized. This in-between state was perhaps the most difficult of all. It denied them the simplicity of rage and the comfort of clarity. It made them question not just the Americans, but themselves. If the stories they'd believed were false, then what did that say about everything else? The showers had been the beginning, but it was the routine, predictable, orderly, strangely humane, that forced them to confront the hardest truth of all. The enemy followed rules. And that meant the lies they had carried might not survive much longer. As the weeks passed, the routines of captivity became part of the prisoner's muscle memory. The whistle, the roll call, the scheduled meals, all of it began to feel less like punishment and more like structure. The women still moved with caution, but the panic that had once lived behind their eyes began to fade. What replaced it was something more complicated, an uneasy realization that their captors were not monsters. This realization was slow, reluctant, and deeply unsettling. They had not been beaten, starved, or publicly humiliated. Instead, they were being preserved, catalogued, maintained, even protected from illness. It was not kindness, but it was not cruelty either. It was policy. That simple fact shook the foundations of what many of them had believed. The enemy was following rules, and that forced them to question not only the Americans, but their own countrymen as well. One evening, Marta sat cross-legged in the tent, fingering the locket that had been returned to her after processing. Her voice was quiet when she finally said it aloud. "We were told surrender would mean shame, but I've never felt more human than when I washed off the dirt." The others didn't argue. They couldn't. That hot shower, once a moment of terror, had become the axis around which their thoughts now turned. It symbolized a truth they hadn't known how to process until now. Erica, who had clung hardest to her fear, confessed one night that she no longer knew who to trust, not even her own memory. Her father had disappeared on the Eastern Front, and for months she imagined him being tortured, denied food, treated like an animal. But here, under American custody, she had been given a toothbrush and a slice of bread. That contrast haunted her. If he had been captured here, she said, would he still be alive? This kind of reflection came with shame. Shame not for losing the war, but for believing the lies that had prepared them to hate. They had repeated those lies to others, built their identities around them. Now, faced with evidence that contradicted everything, they found themselves suspended in a moral freefall. It wasn't just their captors they had misunderstood, it was themselves. Katerina, ever defiant, tried to resist the shift. She insisted that the Americans were only following orders, and that it could all turn at any moment. But even her tone had softened. She had seen the nurse bandage a cut on Anna's arm. She had seen the soldier lift a feverish girl and carry her to shade. No one explained these actions. They simply happened. Quiet, ordinary decency that made cruelty seem like a myth. The question began to surface in quiet moments, in shared looks and unfinished sentences. What if surrender hadn't stripped them of their dignity, but restored it? What if captivity, instead of being a curse, had become a mirror, reflecting how deeply they had been misled? These were dangerous thoughts. They rewrote the story they had been raised on, the one that placed them at the center of a noble struggle against evil. Yet the facts of their daily life in the camp made denial impossible. Food came at regular times. The water was clean. They were not punished for speaking softly or for collapsing from fatigue. There were no public beatings, no random disappearances. The absence of brutality was not a kindness. It was something more powerful, a structure that held, even in victory. And so the women found themselves facing a new kind of surrender, not to the Americans, but to a truth they could no longer ignore. They had not only lost a war, they had lost the myth of who they were and what they thought the world would do to them. The enemy had not humiliated them. He had handed them soap and stepped back. And in that moment, something inside them broke, and something else began. By the time the women were transferred to a larger camp, the memory of the first shower had already crystallized into something more than an event. It had become a symbol. They didn't speak of it openly, not yet, but each of them carried the image like a private relic. Steam rising, soap foaming, water beating down on skin that had braced for poison. That moment had split their reality in two, before and after. Before was fear, indoctrination, certainty. After was confusion, contradiction, and a question they still hadn't answered. What if the enemy had shown more humanity than their own leaders? In the new camp, the routines were similar. Head counts, rations, inspections. But something within the women had changed. They no longer looked at the guards the same way. Suspicion lingered, but it was tempered by something harder to admit: recognition. The enemy was no longer an abstract figure painted in propaganda. He had a face, a voice, sometimes even a name. And he had handed them soap. Conversations deepened at night, under canvas ceilings and flickering lamps. Marta once said quietly, "The shower wasn't mercy, it was procedure. But it meant something to me because it wasn't cruelty." That sentence hung in the air long after she spoke it. No one challenged her. They were all thinking the same thing. The Americans weren't trying to be kind, but they weren't trying to destroy them either. The weight of that realization was almost unbearable. It made the lies feel heavier, not lighter. The women began to question not just what they'd been told about the Allies, but everything they had accepted about their place in the war. If the Americans followed rules, then why had their own government allowed its citizens to starve? Why had children disappeared into flames while command posts still blasted messages of final victory? Shame was no longer abstract. It had a texture now, a scent, the sharp, sterile scent of army-issued soap. It clung to their skin even after the water had dried. Some women began to carry their bars of soap with them in cloth scraps or tucked into pockets, not because they needed them, but because they represented something. Not comfort, not cleanliness, but truth. And yet they were still prisoners, still watched, still numbered. The showers hadn't set them free, but they had shifted the ground beneath them. Dignity, they realized, didn't always arrive with flags and anthems. Sometimes it appeared in a paper-wrapped bar of soap, handed to you by a soldier who didn't care if you were grateful, as long as you followed the line. One night, as the camp quieted, Erica whispered, "When this is over, I want to remember that they made us bathe, that they didn't hurt us when they could have." No one replied, but the silence was full. They knew what she meant. The memory wasn't glorious. It was uncomfortable, but it was real. Years later, many of them would hesitate to tell this part of their story. In bombed-out towns filled with grief, the idea that soap and showers had changed them felt too small, too strange. But it had. Because in that steam-filled moment, when the worst was expected and the ordinary arrived instead, something irreversible had occurred.
The war had taken everything from them: certainty, safety, pride. But it had given them something too: a glimpse of the world beyond fear. A lesson etched in water and scent and touch, that even in defeat there could be rules, and sometimes, in the humblest procedures, humanity reasserts itself, not loudly, but undeniably.